Hey there, I've got the look of a teacher who's about ready to go back to school, that like frantic, look. School starts for us this week, and one of the first things I'm going to do in my classroom is talk to my students about why we study history. And it's such a hard question to answer. If you ask your students, why do we study history, they're probably going to say, oh, so we're not doomed to repeat it. And in fact, when I was in college, I had the privilege of going on a Gilder Lehrman Fellowship to Columbia University for an entire summer, and I was there over lunches, got to meet with some incredible Pulitzer Prize-winning, Bancroft Prize-winning historians. And I remember my friend Catherine, who was there with me, she asked every single person that we had lunch with, all of these famous, well-known historians, why do you study history? Like, what's the purpose? And none of them could answer her. Nobody gave a satisfactory answer. I mean, they would say, oh, well, I like it, or I'm good at it, or things like that, but nobody had a sellable reason for studying history other than, yeah, I kind of like the stories. And so I wanted to talk today about how I teach my students why we study history. And I'm hoping to start a dialogue because I know I don't have all of the answers to this. And so I would love if you leave comments about what you do. Give me some more ideas about ways we can sell this to our students, because in a society that's becoming increasingly more STEM focused, which is great, history is getting lost. Fewer and fewer people are actually majoring in history in college. Fewer and fewer people are valuing the study. In fact, I remember one time I was talking to a parent on the phone about there was an integrity issue with her child, and so we were talking through this, and she said, well, I don't understand what your problem is. It's just a history class, and we need to get away from that mentality, and we need history to be valued. So here's what I do. I ask my students, why should we study history? And inevitably they say those words, well, so we're not doomed to repeat it. And they find out very quickly that I hate that answer, absolutely hate it, for two big reasons. The first reason is it's not at all true. Right? If you've ever studied the 1920s and the 1950s, you know that they look a lot alike. We repeat it. We repeat the Red Scare. And those people knew their history. The people that lived in the 1950s, many of them, were also alive in the 1920s. So we do repeat our history. Now, for my students, since we haven't studied that yet, that usually doesn't ring as much of a bell. So I remind them, I'm like, hey, remember how last year people got suspended or expelled from our school for some bad decisions they made? Do you think that people aren't going to make similar decisions this year? And they're like, well, maybe. And I said, oh, okay, let's go even one step further. Last year, people got put in detention for violating the dress code, for too many tardies, for having their cell phone out during school. And I said, we all know this history, right? We know this is true. And they're like, yeah. And I said, how many of you are going to raise your hands and guarantee to me that you will not get detention for the exact same things? And that's when they start to squirm in their seat, because they know we repeat history. It doesn't matter how much you know something. Men are flawed, and mankind, I should say, is flawed. We're sinful, fallen creatures, and we continue to fall into the same bad habits even when we've already experienced the consequences or seen somebody else experience those consequences as well. So it's not true. The second reason I absolutely hate that answer is that it implies that all history is bad. There's some history that we actually want to repeat. Like, you would never tell somebody, oh, I think we should study the civil rights movement so that we're never doomed to repeat it. Hello, people fighting for their freedoms, that's a story that should inspire us. Throughout American history, we see the fight for independence. We see in the Civil War, like the fight to free slaves. We see the fight for civil rights. Those are good things. So we shouldn't imply that we're doomed to repeat it as if everything in the past was bad, because it's just not true. So if that answer is not acceptable to me, which they find out pretty quickly that it's not, how do I express to my students why we should study history? Well, I give them 5 different things, and just if you need a trigger warning, just know I teach at a private Christian school. I'm a person of great faith, and I'm coming from a Christian worldview. So the first 2 things I'm going to talk about are very much central to my faith, I guess faith is a central part of that. Now, I get that maybe you don't share my faith, or maybe you teach at a school where you can't talk about that, and I get that. So just know that while those first 2 that I'm about to mention are central to the faith, everything after that is more universal. let me fix that. It's more universal. So the first thing I tell my students is that God commands us to study history. It's written throughout Scripture. In fact, if you've read the Old Testament, that is the central theme of the Old Testament, particularly the book of Deuteronomy. But it's not just there. Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, in the New Testament, Corinthians, Colossians, all of these mention God's command to us to remember history. And some if kids are like, so what? I'm like, what do you mean, so what? He commands it. So I'm not going to go through the whole list of scriptures, but I will put in the description below this video, I'll give a short list of my favorite ones that I like to show my students, just so they can see that this is part of God's command. The second thing is that it glorifies God. I mean, gosh, we love studying the American Revolution. It's so inspiring to see what those ordinary men did. But when you actually go and look deeply into their lives, they are so screwed up. They're absolute messes. And so what we see is if God can take absolute messes and do something amazing, miraculous with it, it glorifies Him for us to study that, to see His hand working throughout history, which is one of those, like I said, one of those big reasons why we can't look at history as all of this bad stuff. We need to see where God's hand has been moving throughout, to recognize that and to glorify Him. But here's the other reasons that I give my students. So knowing the past helps us to better deal with the present. And a prime example I give for that is the recent example of the Confederate monuments. So in my school, I was talking to another teacher one day about Confederate monuments, and she's like, I just don't understand what the big deal is. How could they tear down history, you know? And I said, wait a second. I said, do you know the history behind those monuments? Do you know that they were put up not post-Civil War, but they were put up in the 1920s, oftentimes by the KKK, as a symbol of white supremacy? And that stopped her in her tracks. And she was like, whoa. And I said, so it's not necessarily wrong that you don't think that we should take them down, but you can't really fully deal with the issue. You can't really understand where people are coming from if you don't understand the history. We're about to send our students into the world where they're going to have to make some tough decisions. Like lately, regarding immigration, we still have racial conflict. Knowing our history in this nation will better equip them to deal in the future, with the present, with the future, with the issues that will come up, and to do so with grace and humility, not with this superiority of, we got it all figured out, but with a humility and a grace and an empathy for the people around them. Which leads me to my next point, is that understanding history helps you to develop an empathy and an understanding towards others. I use my personal story here. I grew up in the South, very white community, and I was surrounded by people, authority figures in my life, who were like, oh, I don't understand why we have to celebrate Black History Month. They kind of poo-pooed on the idea of civil rights, and it's like, what's the big deal? They're just playing victims. And so I grew up with that mentality because that is what I was taught. But then I studied history. And I remember specifically in graduate school being blown away when I was learning about things like white flight, when I learned about the unintended consequences of the GI Bill, something that we all celebrate, but that ultimately created this huge disparity in the races. When I started studying these things, it gave me an understanding and an empathy for the plight of the African American community in our nation. And it gave me a great respect for people like Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, those others. And so now I don't hold the same attitude that I was taught as a child. Civil rights is actually one of my favorite things to teach my students because I have developed an empathy and an understanding towards other people that I didn't have before. And the final thing that I tell my students is that when we study history, it helps us to understand ourselves, because there are some things about human beings and human nature that are true throughout the centuries. I love when they'll start to read primary sources and they'll see something funny in a primary source. And it's funny, this look on their faces, like what people in the 1800s were funny. Like they had a sense of humor. Like it's so foreign to them that somebody back in the past could be like them. The desire for love, for affection, the desire for freedoms. Like there's certain things that are universal, but then there's also certain things where we are very different. For instance, they usually pick up on the fact that we are much more materialistic than anyone that we've studied in the past. As a nation, as a whole, we are much more materialistic. They'll also pick up, my students will, in the fact that, that as a nation, today people don't really know Scripture. But if you look at the earlier days in American history, Abraham Lincoln, everything Scripture, like he quotes it and quotes it and quotes it, and historians actually have debated whether or not he was a Christian, but that's beside the point. They said, wow, average Americans knew more Scripture than we do. They had a better understanding. And so when you assess where you are similar and where you are different, you kind of have a true sense of what is unique to your culture and your time. And then that allows us to assess that. Are these positive changes? Have we truly made progress? Or are they negative? And so students have great debates on that topic. So those are the reasons, well, first of all, why I hate the idea that we don't study history so that we're doomed to repeat it. Like I said, it's not true. It's absolutely stupid. But it also implies, that everything in history was bad. But the reasons why we do study it, because God commands it. It glorifies Him. Knowing our past better helps us deal with our future. We develop an empathy and an understanding for others and a greater understanding of ourselves that will allow us better self-assessment of where we are as a society than we would have ever been able to do otherwise. So like I said, I would love to hear what you do in your class and what resources you use. So I hope that's been helpful.